So you'll notice we've got some additional furniture up on the stage, and that's because we're going to have some customers up, and we let them sit down. So to move forward, I would like to introduce Anthony up to talk about automation culture with Royal Bank of Scotland. Anthony.
Hello everyone, my name's Anthony Kesterton. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so with our friends and colleagues from Royal Bank of Scotland talking about automation culture. And by that I mean, what are the kind of things that you need to do and think about as you get beyond the basic automation? So this is kind of the relaxed session in the sense that you've just had lunch. So if you want to sit back and close your eyes for a bit, that's also fine. And just listen, and I'll try and hypnotize a lot of you. No, I'm kidding. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all talk a bit about ideas and practices and how you imbibe a culture of automation into your organization. And then we're going to get the folks from RBS to come up and talk a bit about what they're doing. And then we'll open the floor to questions from yourselves. So you get a chance to speak to all of us and ask questions about how you actually get culture, automation culture going. The things I want to talk about are very simple. There's 7 principles or ideas there. And cross-team, cross-platform, automation transparency, reuse, change control, environment transparency, and then orchestration that collaborates. So those are the sort of basic things I'd like to speak about now. First one, cross-team. Phil and Pat earlier today talked about this. Really what you want to do, if you're doing automation, you want to get everyone that's involved in the deployment and management and operations side of your systems and your network elements and all the elements you're controlling with your automation. Get them to work together. Phil talked about network team. The two of us were in a meeting the other day, and we asked the people in the workshop, who's missing? And it was the network guys, isn't it? And so, yeah, so cross-team is not angry with each other. It's how you collaborate and work with each other. So thinking about everyone that needs to be involved in automation and getting them involved is really important, we find. Cross-platform. Now, I don't just mean are you Windows or Linux or something else. I'm also thinking, is it on-premises? Is it internal cloud? Is it public cloud? All of these things, try and build automation such that you can cope with all these things. Even if you're not maybe doing public cloud at the moment or you're not doing hybrid, it doesn't matter. At some point you might do. So try and consider that. Don't try and lock yourself down into a particular type of automation with a particular target, because there will be opportunities to automate things as you get better and better at it. So thinking cross-platform and having a culture of thinking cross-platform from the very beginning really does help. Automation transparency. Okay. In your organizations, you've probably got people, and you might be those people, that have written scripts, things that you know how they work and understand and so on. And that's good while you're around. In the US, they call it the truck count, but in the UK, we call it the bus count. So how many people need to get run over by a bus before all your automation stops working or no one knows what it does anymore? And that's really quite dangerous to have that. So if you can actually do your automation in such a way that everyone can understand it, everyone that needs to, everyone can go and have a look at what automation is taking place. It's having that idea in your mind. Whenever you do something, someone is going to have to read it when you're not there for whatever reason. That transparency is really important. And certainly from an Ansible perspective, the idea of playbooks and natural language type playbooks is really important. So that's the other one of the other things we really want to focus on. Keep in mind as you try and do more and more automation. Reuse. There's loads of modules. We've been talking about that a lot today. Your last thing should be to write it from scratch. You should always go and see if it's been done before. Look inside your organization to see if another group has done it before. Look outside the organization. Go to Galaxy. Look for modules. Try and write as little as possible. The less you write, the less mistakes you'll make. So try and think about reuse. That implies other things as well, in the sense that if you are doing reuse and you're not writing stuff from scratch, there has to be a place to find it. So go and talk to the software development people in your organization if you're not already part of that group, and find out how do they share things. You might get some really good ideas off them. But the idea of only defaulting to writing it from scratch as the last option is really important if you want to imbue a culture of automation. Once you do that, and once you talk to the software development people, you'll be starting to think of change control. And it's not just change control, it's version control as well. So what version of that bit of automation actually went in and was used to deploy that system that you might not deploy again for months and months? So the exact setup, the exact versions and so on, that's what you need to bear in mind. This one, took me a while to think of this one, logging. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that whatever happens to those systems, you can actually go back and trace through. If you're in a highly regulated organization or that's under a lot of regulation, then audit and compliance want to actually see this stuff. They want to see what happened to that system and where it potentially went wrong or went right. And even more important for operations people, they would like to see exactly what happened. So audit and logging when you're doing your automation is really important. Don't skip steps. Don't assume that people understand what happened. It should be there in writing exactly what's going on. And again, by encouraging this from the very beginning as you do your automation, this will help you build that culture of automation. And then the final point about orchestration. Okay. Orchestration that collaborates. Again, it's been mentioned a few times today already. There's a strong chance you'll be using tooling or utilities from other people that you also need to bring under control and need to make part of your automation pipeline. And so, for example, if you're doing stuff with web servers, there'll be admin tools you use for your web servers or your JE servers or whatever you're working with. And you'll be calling those. But make sure those elements have APIs. If the tools you're using right now don't have APIs, go and get something that does, because you'll never know how you're going to daisy chain all this stuff together. Right. So it's really quite simple. It's just these things that will help you put a culture of automation into your organization. So it's cross-team, cross-platform, automation transparency, and that's really important, reuse, the change control bit, environment transparency, the logging, the audit, and then finally orchestration that all kind of works together. So those kinds of ideas and practices and principles, things that you're trying to do, are really quite important. But rather than just hear me talking about it, what I'd like to do is invite our friends from Royal Bank of Scotland to come up and we can have a bit of a chat about what they're doing. So Raj, Val, Jakob, come and take a seat. This is quite fun actually, because normally when I go and see these people, they're asking me all sorts of hard questions. Now's my chance.
Payback.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So, fingers on buzzers. You ready? You'll start a question for 10, no conferring. No, sorry, wrong two. So before you come home today, could you bring skim milk? Oh, not really a thing. So what would be quite nice is just really for you to introduce yourself. I'll start here. You want to explain who you are and what you're doing at RBS?
Hi, so my name is Kuba Wieczorek. I work with Ban Raj. I'm an engineer in an automation and tooling team. I joined the Royal Bank of Scotland a bit over 2 years ago and kind of was lucky enough to be embedded in a team that is at the very heart of the automation culture and push in RBS. So yeah, that's my day-to-day job recently has been actually setting up Ansible Tower as the heart of our automation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
Cool. My name is Raj Dassault. I'm one of the principal engineers within RBS. And my sort of role at the moment is I'm sort of looking at the technical lead in terms of the CI/CD pipelines that we've got within RBS, so understanding the technologies, the capabilities that we're actually making available to our engineers across the bank.
Cool, so Balkanga, also a principal engineer. So my role is to run an incubator function. So the organisation has got lots of innovation going on, but the challenge is how do we scale that in the environment? So very traditional IT function, we're starting to do things like adoption of things like CI/CD, but the ambition of the organisation is to move that faster. So what we need to do is actually help drive the backlog for a lot of the automation culture by bringing those innovation propositions to the client.
I think what's really interesting as we go through this, you'll hear a bit more about what they're doing as an organisation to try and improve the culture and really make automation a fundamental part of what they're doing. So I guess probably one of the first questions really, how has automation affected your culture in the organisation?
Yeah, so we started our journey several years ago. So about 2012 is we started looking at the actual concept within RBS for bringing in automation. We used to have a very heavy operating function where the rate of change would be based on the number of individuals we'd had available to us that could do the changes across our products. Things ranged between manual steps, manual processes, where it may have taken maybe a full week to do a complete global change. Whereas what we started looking at is how do we actually provide those services or those repeated patterns back to our customers. So instead of it being done by a resource, how do we repeat that process and make that available via some sort of product? Ansible is obviously something we've been looking at, so that the individuals can run at scale themselves, so they can make continuous deployments, they can do multiple releases, enabling them to learn fast, which is kind of the main things we're looking at. It also meant that we moved from, say, in metrics perspectives, we were doing roughly around 4,000 changes per year based on certain products, whereas if I look at the stats today, we're in excess of 100,000 per month.
Wow, that's a big increase.
Yeah, it's a huge increase, but there's also a change in culture as well with the individuals. Initially, it's very scared. Individuals are taking on the actual responsibility themselves. Should I hit that button or not? As opposed to, well, it's the operator's responsibility. But that culture's changed over the last few years, whereas people are actually taking that onus on and they're doing the changes themselves, which is great.
And you were talking about customer. Who is that customer?
So our customers are primarily the engineers across the organisation.
Developers, engineers, app teams, across the organisation. So we started off with one division and got the division, the appetite of that division was to do cost control. So one of the things was we were driving the good SDLC. So it was they had a vision, right? They needed to drive this, they needed to drive cost optimization, didn't have as many people available to do things. But the ambition of the organisation was still to deliver quickly to the customers, get features out there. So it started driving that kind of cultural adoption. So things like Agile, DevOps, all that kind of buzzwords that you hear, but that's how we've driven this. But at the same time, what you need to do is actually empower teams. So there's no point having a single function that can do this for a very large organisation or a very large division, as it were. We're now expanding that to the enterprise. What we need to do is actually showcase to people, simplify things, understand the sequence that you're doing things. You can then standardise.
Yep.
You can standardise, you can automate. If you can automate, you can start having the appetite to self-service, and that's the end goal, is that you actually get the thing into the hands of the users to be able to manage on behalf of their customer, because otherwise we're the bottleneck, we're the people that they have to schedule things with, albeit, we could start scaling our team, etc. But as I said, with that particular division, that wasn't really going to be the case. And we're now starting to see that across the organisation, right? So we have a static headcount effectively in technology, and we're trying to make that more efficient. So we need to be able to drive that value for the organisation. So we're starting to take this to the enterprise now as well.
And it's not just the automation processes, there's also the behaviour. So what we've been looking at is the ecosystem. So if you're looking at the SDLC, the software delivery lifecycle, it's how do we put processes in places that allow the developers, the engineers to adopt a lot of the products that we have, the capabilities we have, and move all the way through the automation processes, but it's simplified, standardized across the bank. Because the idea within RBS is to move to, everyone's aware of microservices. We want to break down our applications to allow the teams to move in an agile way, doing quicker releases, being able to learn quicker, like we've mentioned. But it meant that we do need to have an ecosystem in place to allow them to do that. What we didn't want is across the industry or across the organization, everyone doing it in different ways, because the moment that happens, you just cannot automate something like that. So first is look at the behaviors of the engineers, the developers, simplify that, standardize the way that we're doing development within the organization, but also to provide the tools, because we didn't want to We didn't want to go and dictate this is how you must do development, but we wanted to put some controlled governance around that, that if you develop in these options, you've got a catalogue of options to you available within the bank. That will give you a route through to production quicker. And
Much resistance in some of that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, so it's a journey, right? So you've got lots of silos, you've got lots of teams working slightly different ways. So we understand why we have the control framework that we have in place. You have lots of people that are coming in to audit things, but it's quite done after the fact. So people aren't actually saying, how do we actually take those controls and apply them all the way through from development onwards? Yeah.
So we got this slide, something we put together. So it shows what our current state is and obviously what we're moving towards. But when we're talking about an ecosystem, we're referring to things like, obviously the standards like source control, your CI engines, things like your build agents that you've got, and binary repositories. That's pretty standard in software development. But then in terms of the actual orchestration side of things, Ansible's fantastic because it does a lot of the orchestration for us. It's got the modules that are reusable. But if you're thinking about the way we do change, when we're developing and we're building applications, we want to ensure we've got things like secret management. Within the organization, we've got strict regulatory controls relating to how we're doing passwords, access controls to things like public cloud, to things like, how do we develop like config? So where do we put our configuration? So there's lots of products capabilities that we've made available. And that's something that our developers can adopt at pace. So the idea is to get our developers onboarded within a day or within hours, ideally. And that allows them to start thinking about their business logic as opposed to worrying about where do I start, what product should I use. And it's more for them to look at what's available and contribute back.
Yep.
Okay. And now you were quite new to this organisation and so on. How did you find coming into this?
Yeah, it was quite a steep learning curve, obviously. I joined without a tech background. So yeah, like comparatively to some other things that I learned, Ansible is obviously one of the tools that's easier to adapt. So Raj tasked me with being like the principal lead for delivery of Tower itself as part of the bigger tooling component that we were doing recently. And yeah, it was good. And definitely, I think I was at least lucky enough to step into this culture and it's already developed and our team worked a certain way. And now for me, when I read some sort of DevOps book or case studies and I see how big organizations operate, and CI and things like that, using the DevOps culture and automation is something new that they need to bring in. Like for me, that was something that I stepped into from day one. So I feel like I'm fairly embedded in that.
Made it a lot easier for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Kubernetes been fantastic. I mean, if we look at our delivery, so obviously Ansible Tower is something that we're using as an enterprise product. It allows us to actually do the integration, but if you're looking at the actual process around Ansible, we had lots of sessions this morning about what Ansible can give you. It can give you the ability to use modules, how you initiate change, things like that. But how do you bring a product like that into an organization where you don't want to give people free-for-all access to do what they want, especially if you're regulated? So what we've built is obviously Ansible Tower is our engine, but then we have a process around the way we do playbooks. So we've got repeated playbooks that individuals use for deploying into cloud or deploying into various containers that we have. But it meant that we've got control in terms of a CI/CD process for playbooks that our customers as an engineers can adopt. And that's something that Kuba's been putting in place, and it's now starting to run at scale. We've got the concept where we want to enable self-service of self-service. So as much as we have the tools, we don't want to be the bottleneck of being, well, we need to write a playbook for something. We want contribution from the community. Yeah. And the community is RBS and the internet, I guess.
Yeah, so I think, we start with open source. So, we've started bringing open source culture into the bank. So people start to get familiarized with these tools, and actually it's very early, quick adoption of actually getting teams. Because it's not a huge amount of investment from a product perspective. So that was one thing, and the goal is to federate that. So we put some standards in, but the goal is for the organization to start contributing, the technology organization and the partners we work with to actually start contributing to that. So we're at that stage now where we've launched that out as a federated model. I think the other things for us is that really what we're trying to do is actually get to the point where we're getting to patterns. So repeatable patterns, because a lot of the things is today, as I said, the organization is very siloed, but we can see that many parts of the organization are trying to achieve the same things. So it's trying to get to the point where we can actually get people to start contributing to patterns. So create like an open source community inside the bank. And then effectively what we start seeing is adoption across. So you're not in the retail space, the commercial space, you're actually an engineer that's trying to add value for the organization. So we're starting to see a lot more things around reusability. So it's not the same amount of time to get someone to kickstart their project, because what they're now figuring out is they may already be part of the puzzle, the framework, the things that they need. And what they're really doing is actually adding the bits that are specific to that particular journey that they're actually doing, that feature they're trying to implement on behalf of the customer of the business.
And this whole open source thing, it sounds like it's really changing the culture in the bank. And how did you kind of get them kicked off? How did you get people to start thinking, this is something I can reuse?
So trust, I think, yes. I think the tendency is for large organisations to go out to large vendors to try to solve problems for them. And ultimately, it's going to be your engineers.
Yep.
So really getting stuff out to engineers and developers very quickly, and that's the open source model, obviously, is the spirit behind that. And actually then they can start demonstrating to their teams, their leaders. If we were to start adopting this approach and start collaborating across the organisation, this may start benefiting them, right? So you always want to bring back to the person that's actually funding you why we're doing this. So open source allows you to adopt and trial things very quickly without having to wait for somebody else to pay for some kind of large enterprise agreement or something. Yeah. And then if we start seeing that, okay, the reason why we picked this particular product, there's a massive community out there. And what you can start doing is seeing that people can start self-learning. And what you're finding is there's talent out there that is used to using these tools. So it becomes a cycle, right? So you're attracting the right types of talent into the organisation because they see that you're using these types of tools.
Yep. Brilliant. Yeah. So now, I believe we've got some stuff that you can show us about what you've been doing in the automation and that.
Absolutely.
So if we can bring up the laptop screen here.
It's the Blue Peter moment. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I'm going to show a little video that basically presents a simple example of a journey that, from the user's perspective, when it comes to a dev going through software development lifecycle. So basically, you're going to show it from creating a project all the way to deploying it to non-production environment. Do we have the screen yet? I don't think we do. Oh.
Yeah. I'll just unlock it.
Yeah, no worries.
Security.
It's not really Darth Vader.
It's my alter ego that was up there.
Cool.
Press the space one up. Start playing.
Awesome. So yeah, let's start it. So basically, the journey will be to deploy something to a PaaS and public cloud, starting with our catalog of microservices. So we provide the kind of archetype for microservices, which means that we save developers a lot of boilerplate code work. Here we use Vertex, for example, because it allows us for a lot of throughput. But yeah, basically what we try to do is focus devs on their actual domain to get them to solve the problems that bring value to the business rather to having to deal with how they deploy things and actually having for them to work out their own automation in that way. Like they can contribute if they have non-standard requirements, and obviously Ansible allows for that because it's flexible. So here, yeah, if let's say we made the code changes already that created microservice, we can then push it to the source control code. And if someone uses our frameworks who starts to use the archetype, it means that they basically get plugged straight into tooling. It's a very close integration. It's kind of tough balance to strike because on one hand, we want to be opinionated enough to allow people to seamlessly integrate with our staff. And on the other hand, we want it to be flexible enough for them to be able to solve problems their own way. And I think we got it just right. And once you push, basically, that runs an automated job. And we have pipeline as code for CI/CD. So it's all kind of build and burn infrastructure. All the tests and builds are running automatically, which means that before any commit gets integrated into the main trunk branch in the source control, it has to pass all the tests before a binary gets deployed to any sort of repository for that and be deployed to any sort of infrastructure after. It also needs to pass the tests. And then, yeah, so here we see the deployment, obviously, of the binary to the repo. It passed all the tests. And the missing bit that we had was a sort of engine that will allow us to flexibly integrate with any sort of hosting platform or infrastructure we want. And that's when Ansible came in. The bit that really gives us the flexibility, it can be a factor 12 microservice that goes onto PaaS, or it can be one of the more standard sort of Java, old school web services that needs normal infrastructure. And the workflow is going to be identical and seamless for any user, which means that also people can cross-skill between teams and kind of swap roles more easy, because as long as they use our framework, basically their experience after writing code is pretty much the same. And yeah, then deployment happens, and obviously that starts spinning up environments. Another thing that's built into that will be governance. So obviously, once you have all the tests, there is audit from all the steps of that being stored. We version control our infrastructure and our pipelines. And once that happens, if you actually want to promote code to different environments, can also be automated. And before you go to prod, you need to have a valid change record. So there is no way someone pushes something to production by accident or even maliciously trying to actually skip part of the change control because they have pressure from the business, basically take that opportunity away. And that's basically it, and that could be obviously extended to any sort of infrastructure.
And we kept the demo fairly simple, but the idea is that it's the same process that would follow all the way from development all the way through to production. And that meant that obviously when you're getting closer to a production environment, that's when the controls and governance sort of kick in. So we've already got the authorization authentication processes, but how does, like, for example, RBS initiate change in a production environment? That's specific to us as an organization. So we've built that as an ecosystem around Ansible to make sure that once we've met those guidelines and principles, that's when we'll then push something through into a production environment. So things like change control, things like, have we done code coverage, have we done any threat analysis, those sort of concepts are all something we've baked into the ecosystem to ensure that what we're releasing to production is something that has been tested, has been certified as something that should be in production as well.
I think we've got domains and COEs, and we also recognise they're going to move at different pace. So one of the things we've done is actually made it so individual areas, teams, down to a feature team can decide what their governance process is going to be, so we're not dictating that. So if you have the appetite doing continuous delivery, that exists. So as long as you can standardise and template things, you can go all the way to production with continuous delivery. But at the same time, we also recognise that the organisation is regulated, it has got compliance around it. Different divisions have different types of controls they need to sort of evidence as well. So what we've done is actually given that back to the individual teams. So they decide, right, what's the appetite for delivering that change, right? It could be everything up to non-prod, it can be seamless and away you go, but actually production requires 1 approval, 2 approvals, 10 approvals, it requires more scrutiny. So really allowing teams to move at the pace that they're comfortable doing, that's quite important as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Bal. It's the maturity of the team. So the ability is there to run at pace. It depends how comfortable you are as a team to be able to do something like that. Like, these guys that work in our development function, we can run at pace at the moment where we can do releases within the same day, which means from development all the way through to production, based on the controls and governance, we have demonstrated that we can actually build and deploy within the same day through to prod using the ecosystems that we have.
Probably the other thing is, it's not shown in the video as such, but all the operate bits are embedded in from development onwards. So it's not something you're handing over to a team at the end, and then so our concept is no ops. It's not that we won't have operators, but it's that's seen as a sort of value add that we cannot allow people to go straight into using the APM tools. They're going to get logging out of the box. It's not things as the boilerplate includes all of the ecosystem around operate. And one of the questions you'll always get back is from the operate functions is, right, when you self-service, what is our job? And your job is now really to stop doing those repeatable tasks because you've got the admin credentials, you're allowed to do something in an environment, we can automate that, self-service that. What we're now doing is actually reskilling and educating those team members to start doing those value-add tasks, which is actually look at business value, actually increment the features on these capabilities that we're building. So patterns capabilities and actually really start looking at the features. So we end up having more efficient teams, so we're not having to actually scale. As I said, we've got sort of pressures around headcount like most people do, and what we're doing is actually using that resource in a more sort of efficient manner now. I have a capability to do that.
It's been really fascinating watching these folks go from sort of relatively new ideas for the bank and actually become more and more sophisticated. And I think what's really impressive is sophistication makes it simpler to the end users rather than make it more complicated. And I think that's just one of the things that you've done really well here.
Simplify. That's the first thing we can say to anyone is simplify your environment, and then you can standardize it, and then the rest of it will happen.
Yes.
Come about.
Now, there's a lot of experience sitting here next to me. So I think what we should do now is open this up to questions. They have all basically done all the things I was talking about earlier. So the cross-team, the cross-platform, the transparency, the reuse, change control. I like your self-service thing. Maybe we should have to have an 8th one. It was 7 plus or minus 2. But really this whole idea of how you can take something which is traditionally seen as very complicated, an organization like a bank, with the regulatory frameworks, with the different types of business the bank does, with the different parts of the IT organization. So let's just open up for questions now and see if you've got anything you want to ask about what RBS has done to improve the culture of automation. And there's one over there.
Hi, James Spender. I'm a contractor, done some work at a few banks. Does cross-platform in RBS's context extend as far as things like Unisys mainframes running mortgage applications,
So
and
that's where
ATM networks on Windows? And
Yeah, so that's where we're moving into domain and COE model. So we have an enterprise agile transformation having. There's a transformation happening in the bank, and that's across all. That's including all of the core banking functions, right? So that's actually seen as a massive enabler for the organisation and its ambition, because a lot of disruption happening in financial services. So this is not just aimed at the digital. So digital is where this was born, but definitely in the core bank as well. So a lot of work happening in the CI/CD space. Some of the tooling is different because some of the technology there is different. The concepts are the same, right? So do CI/CD, employ the standard software engineering principles, and start enabling teams. Because what you tend to find is that the culture becomes quite difficult because some challenges may have happened. And really, and then what we do is actually throw manual steps at that, right? And then what we do is end up with a very complicated environment. So what we're really doing is enabling those teams, as we are doing in digital, to start simplifying things, standardize, and adopt exactly the same principles, albeit some of the technology may be different, but the same principles.
So there's one here and one there,
There's one there as well.
and there.
Thank you. Just an extension to the last question the gentleman over here asked. What I just want to know is what challenges did you face in terms of, when we talk about cross-platform, in terms of bringing in the release and change control frameworks that obviously you've engineered and architected into areas such as really complex application environments? Because application support teams would tend to have their own way of doing releases, change management control, and so on. What challenges did you face? I mean, I could give you an example of a typical application environment that I'm sort of thinking of. I mean, Murex environments, for example. They're very complicated and have many parts. But what challenges have you seen in terms of the work that you've done in areas such as that?
So this is sort of related to the whole transformation within the bank. There was a program that we kicked off probably around 2 years ago, and that was to actually bring the entire organisation together from the top down as well as the bottom up, and that was to encourage the individuals that own the different platforms and understood the different parts of the areas to actually work with us, so that it's not this is something that we want to bring in, but collectively we want to change as an organisation. And to do that, we need to change different aspects. So things like the change control, things like the change process that we have right now, the governance model that we do for getting to production. And those teams worked embedded with our feature team. So Bal mentioned the fact that we're setting up COEs. That also meant that we organised our teams with the right individuals from those different areas so that they can contribute with the way that the flow should work. So it's not something we're pushing upon, but we're working collaboratively with each other to understand how that process should work. And over those 2 years, we've come up with an agreement in terms of the way that change is done. So from what you saw there, that's how we integrate into our change governance model. In terms of having an operational tick to say that you've actually met all of the bank's guidelines, that is something that we worked in parallel with them to say, what can we automate right now? What can we do in the future as part of that journey? So understanding the customer journeys, understanding what their processes are, and understanding how we want to work, that was something we did over the last 2 years.
Yeah. I think it's important that when you start dealing with these teams, the traditional teams, that you're actually targeting all parts of the team, all the people actually doing the doing, all the way to the leaders of that particular area. So you need to temper the language to make sure that it's relevant to the audience. Yeah. So there was an appetite, right? So the organisation had the appetite to start accelerating because for various reasons we felt we were behind the market. So there was a big push to try to get us up to start innovating and start adding, start taking adoption of things like cloud, etc. So we also had to temper that. The organisation had a risk and culture that was because we had a notable event in 2012, right? So an issue happened, had a reaction in the organisation, so we needed to make sure that we understood how do we temper the ambition of certain parts of the business and also at the same time being safe. So make sure that you target all the various people. So see them, every single role is a value-add role until we can codify it, right? And then effectively, then you move on to the next value-added role. So understand why we need to do things, the way we need to do them, and actually then go start working through them and through evidence, right? And provide the evidence to them in a format that's distillable and they can understand. So we did this thing called Moonshot, right? And that was bringing various things together. So we were given a slightly different path to production, albeit in a very small sort of fashion, in the sense that a bunch of microservices in our private cloud, and where we could start proving that we could change the way audit was done and logging was done, how controls were done, start bringing in concepts of automation and what tools do we need to bring into the organization. So don't try to start large, right? Because that's always going to start having a reaction. Plus, you're trying to then get lots of teams at the same page very quickly, is target the change. What you'll find is when you start speaking to these teams, you will find the change advocates, go target them and help them sell it within their teams. That's a key part of it, I think.
You need to engage with them and actually make sure that they are part of your journey. Otherwise, it'll feel like you're imposing something onto them. So get them involved, get to understand what their ideas are and introduce that into the platforms.
Yeah. Amount of teams that think automation is magic. And is one of the things we saw was that even if when we first started doing this, they still wanted to manually evidence the thing did actually do what it was supposed to do. And then they start getting confidence, right? So you can't just react to that. You have to start demonstrating and showing, and then they start getting confidence. It's empirical evidence, right? You're showing and demonstrating to them this is a more mature, more consistent way of doing things, and they need to buy into that.
It's exactly like what we showed in the demo. Like we showed you logging into AWS and we showed you something was green. That's what people actually want to see for some reason. So even if Ansible automates everything, can you just show me it working on that box, please? Because I don't trust the automation suite. And that was the behavior that we had to change to say, actually, look, you have to trust the tools because that's what you're using, not what's running on the end box. Your tests should be able to validate what you've deployed or what you've released.
Lots of false dawns. So we've had lots of these adoptions in the bank, but at a project or division level. So this is the first time we actually bring it to the enterprise. And so I think that's the other thing, you need to be able to start bringing people along the journey and whatever the sort of safe way of doing that in your organization.
And as someone outside the organisation, I've watched how these folks have really done a good job of selling it inside the organisation. So they have internal technical sort of fest type things and so on. They're always there, they're always showing stuff, they're always taking ideas and things. And that's how you get it adopted. Sorry, that was quite a long answer to the question. Any other questions here?
So I have a question. I have multiple versions, like dev, test, staging, production, and multiple playbooks and multiple binaries. So the scenario is like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. 1.1 is production, 1.4 is development. The scenario is rather than testing at the latest stage, so once you promote from dev to test, it will backward compatible, it will check with the 1.1 production version. If it passes, so web code should work with database 1.1 version. If it is passes, then it will promote to the staging and production. So what is the best Git structure or how we will do it? Because we were able to do it with manual step. We will say, okay, run this version with a check whether it is backward compatible with the production. New dev web code is compatible with the production database code. Yeah, because dev is 1.5 and production is 1.1. So test with the backward compatibility. If it is okay, then promote with the new 1.5 version with web and dev. So what is the best way with Git as well as the automation? I can do with manual, but
That sounds like quite a complex question.
And what you do in the static world, where static infrastructure is not something that's going to change, is probably different to what you can do when you have immutable infrastructure. You can do things like canary deployment. So, yeah, you're going to be hampered by how your environment's set up. So if you've got standard data centers, static infrastructure, virtual physical, you're going to have to create a model that works within that environment. And we've had to do that. And I think, as you start looking at microservices and you start looking at immutable infrastructure, you can start thinking about canary deployments, a whole bunch of different ways, toggling features on and off. Then that actually gives you a lot more flexibility. So I don't know if you want to cover the first static bit.
Can I just clarify? The question was that you're moving between multiple versions, between multiple environments. How do you control that?
question is like, rather than testing anything on the staging environment, I want to test whether my new web code is compatible with the production.
Yeah, so that's definitely what we would call the blue-green deployments. We have that concept in production. The idea is that you build and burn. So if you're building a release for production and you want to validate that, you have to think about your own application, about how that integrates. So you need to make sure that you can have a running app platform in parallel. Sounds like more specific to your environment, but you would have that running in parallel with, say, production. And the moment you validated your test, that's when you would flip and say, that's now my running production services, and then you can shut down your old one. What you wouldn't do is say, let's shut down production, reload the new version of your code, and that's now production while you're testing it. You'd run them in parallel. So you need to set up your environments that you can do things like that, because that then enables you to test and release quicker, which is how we do it from dev as well. So our devs are immutable all the way through to production. So we have no differences between dev and production. They are always identical.
Yeah, I would say that as you get more comfortable with the deployment process, because it's automated and like Raj said before, we can do it in one day, you have less of a drift in changes and commits between versions.
Absolutely.
Which means we'll never really get to a situation where it's a terrifying change to go from UAT to production or from development to production, because the changes are really incremental. It means we could release stuff weekly, right? And we're not even talking digital, we're deep backend, and we still do releases fairly often, and we just don't allow for the backlog of changes that need to be brought into production to be too big. The smaller the change is, the less complexity we bring in, which means if something even goes wrong, it's really easy to revert and debug and stuff like that. So basically just don't allow those environments and versions to drift too much. The releases are smaller and more often.
You have to be disciplined, right? So the way you construct that change is you don't allow something to promote, like Kuba said, and leave it there for 6 months, because at that point you'll be like, somebody press that button, but I'm not going to be available, because I don't want to see what happens.
I mean, decoupling your configuration from your... There's a whole bunch of things you can do. As I said, there's many things, best practice you need to start doing in the organization, be it static stuff, static infrastructure, be it standard traditional containers, doing microservices. It's decouple your configuration, understand what is in which environment, don't have that checklist model. Right, so we've seen lots of issues where people are still running lots of things with lots of people with checklists, running things manually and evidencing and auditing manually. And what you end up having is configuration drift, because it's hard to manage that, especially when you've got lots of change going through that environment.
So certainly we can carry on some of these conversations. The folks here and some of the RBS people down here are available during the day if you want to catch them. We have time for one more question. So whoever gets to the mic first.
Make it easy.
Oh, sorry, one at the back here. Last one at the back.
If you could start your journey again, would you change anything? What things would you look at changing after you've...
So actually making sure that we understood the various personas, right? So we're all techies, we all automatically assume this is the best way to do things, but you have to recognize that the organization has many value-add functions, like control is a value-add function, risk is. So probably the way we would have sold this and positioned this with those functions would have been different, but got them onto the journey a lot quicker. There was a lot of frustration where we're showing things that we were feeling this is a better way to manage, more controlled, but we weren't putting in a language. We hadn't brought them along on the journey. So I would say that so there's a tendency to go off in the silos because you feel they're not going to listen to you. They have no appetite to change. What tends to happen is they're driven by their business. So we would have probably brought them into the journey a lot quicker than we probably did. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. I would like to thank very much the folks from RBS here today. And as I said, they are around during the rest of today, so please corner them during the coffee breaks and so on. But thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Pleasure.